Welcome back to another question and answer video. Sam and I are going to be doing these every Sunday, and I'm going to ask Sam your guys' questions. So if you have any questions, make sure you leave them on this video. All right, first question. How would you go about improving conditioning while minimizing interference with strength training?
So a lot of people would give like the generic answer of like, oh, just limit your rest times, use your weight training to condition you. And frankly, what I've found is the easiest way to do this is just zone two cardio. People always say, oh, we should do hit cardio because it's more similar to what we're doing in the weight room. But the problem is, I do find that when you push your hit cardio reasonably hard, you kind of have to program around it because there is a pretty meaningful fatigue there, and it's kind of an overlap in like kind of the energy systems used to what we're doing when we're lifting weights. Those energy systems are already being taxed. I really like just having athletes accumulate a certain amount of zone two work per week, just like walking on a treadmill or sitting on like a stationary bike, just kind of going to the upper ends of how hard they can work while breathing through their nose. No, that isn't like a definite way to find zone two, but it's a decent proxy that anyone can do without having any equipment, and just find how much work you need to do per week, kind of hanging out in that zone two to get you in a little bit better shape. And I find that the fatigue associated with that is pretty negligible. It could just be like what we had Kirsten do actually, is just like, hey, we're just going to call this your warm up and do a little bit more than what we would do for just a warm up as a way to trick you into consistently just spending a little bit of this time doing zone two work. So Kirsten would just hop on the treadmill or on the stationary bike for 10 minutes for her 5 sessions a week. And boom, that's 50 minutes spent in zone two per week, which can get you in a lot better shape.
And if you're just starting this, I recommend doing it at the beginning and not the end of your workout so you don't skip it.
Yeah, there's definitely it's putting it at the beginning is good. But to answer your question, there's a whole lot of different ways to do this. I saw somebody replied to your comment and said like things like sleds, things like kettlebell swings are all great ways to get your conditioning up. There's a million ways to roam in terms of how to get to in good shape. Tons of ways to do it. My preferred one, not that it's the only way, right? Sometimes you can use strongman stuff. Sometimes you can use hit on a wind bike. All of these things are going to work. I just like just putting in zone two cardio because I don't really have to make any training considerations for training economy. If anything, I find it increases the amount of training I can do during the week to get in better shape. And that offset, like however much we get better in shape, offsets the like minimal fatigue costs. So that's usually my option.
All right, considerations you would make for training in the morning, 4 to 6 a.m. time frame after 8 hours of sleep, as it relates to powerlifting and strongman, specific warm ups, nutrition, etc.
Okay, yeah. Oh, just to tack on to that last one, just to make sure I cover my bases and acknowledge things that are important. A lot of people would be like, well, what about the interference effect? That's why a lot of people favor towards hit cardio because they're afraid steady state is going to kill their gains. I think you would have to be pushing to reasonably high levels of performance as an endurance athlete before that interference effect really affects your progress. I think just the fact that you get in better shape and you're able to handle and recover from more sets of your strength or hypertrophy training is going to far outweigh whatever small interference effect happens there. So unless you're doing a ton of it, I really wouldn't worry too much in my experience. But in terms of training in the morning, I was actually talking to some of my clients about this not long ago. Drinking water, like if you wake up in the middle of the night, some people avoid drinking water because they don't want to have to get up to pee and they don't want to interrupt their sleep. And there's enough smart people that do that I can't say it's stupid. If you're training in the morning, when you wake up, I would sip some water because you always wake up in a dehydrated state. It's a prolonged period without drinking. You might be sweating a little bit. Sipping water through the night, maybe putting salt in it can help you wake up in a little bit more of a hydrated state. But for my athletes, some of the things I say is like, hey, I want you to have a standardized amount of water that you have in your system before you enter the gym, whether you drink it with your breakfast, whether you drink it like first thing in the morning, you gulp down a bunch of water, or whether you drink it on your drive to the gym. Let's just say, oh, 1 liter, 2 liter. You need to experiment with what makes you feel the best while you train, but setting a minimum for water intake, making sure that we have a carb heavy meal that doesn't sit too heavy in your stomach and doesn't digest super slow. So making sure we're getting in carbs, whatever you can eat in the morning is going to be good. We don't want to be in a fasted state. Even if you feel good, we're going to perform a little bit better if we have some carbs in us. Making sure that we salt that breakfast to taste is huge. You could have things like a body armor. Electrolyte is a good like energy, like it's not an energy drink. What's it called? Like a hydration drink, sports drink. You could have something like that has a little bit more electrolyte content, or you could just add a little bit of salt to your water. These things to make because you want to think water, you want to think carbs, and you want to think electrolytes. A little bit of protein is good, but if we're going to eat afterward, it's not the biggest deal in the world. Really, we want to be making sure we fuel that session. So water, carbs, water, carbs, and electrolytes are kind of the big things you want to check before you walk into the gym. You probably also want to bring a drink with you while you train that checks those three notes. Maybe it's just a Gatorade with some salt in it, right? Carbs, electrolytes, water. So we're continuing to kind of improve our hydration status while we train in addition to beforehand. And then how much you warm up is pretty individual. The ability to train in the morning is a trainable quality. So at first, when you switch to training in the morning, your performance is going to be terrible. There's a lot of mechanisms through which gradually our performance in the morning will get better. There's a cool podcast I might link somewhere in the comments about that. But that would be my answer.
What are your thoughts on the generally advised weight classes by height, and why do they exist? And I'll add, do you know what they are? Is that like a normal thing? Is it vague?
It's vague. It's observational. It's like Boris Shaiko in his like powerlifting book has like a little chart. If you're this tall, eventually your most competitive weight class will probably be this. And he based it off of just like looking at IPF worlds, like the top 5 guys in each weight class, what's their kind of average height.
Because I've heard you do that, right? Where you say, okay, well, this weight class people tend to be this tall, but I didn't know if because the guy said so I didn't know if there were the recommendations.
So I don't know if there's like, no, there's not like there's not like some big like governing body that put out like recommendations. It's more of an observational thing across sports that there's generally like some people will say weight classes are just height classes in disguise. The general idea behind that is there's a kind of certain like weight to height ratio that most people achieve to do their best lifting. Now that's going to vary from sport to sport. Like the weight to height ratio for a weightlifter might be a little bit different than that weight to height ratio for a powerlifter. But a lot of people find that their progress really kind of takes off when they reach like roughly a certain BMI. A lot of that just comes down to leverages. A lot of that comes down to just putting on more lean tissue, as we always talk about on the channel, biggest predictor, blah, blah, blah. Achieving that, it's one of those things where it's like, it is good to know. Most good athletes that I know have some understanding of that. But that being said, I think people will rush to that competitive weight. And it's like most of those athletes built into that weight over a long time because muscle building is really slow. If you're in your first year of lifting and you're like, well, I'm 5'10", and according to this chart, I need to be at least 105 kilos, like 230 pounds. That doesn't mean you should just speed run, dirty bulk your way to 230. It's more of like, it's not like you have to do this. It's just something to keep in the back of your head is, I'm not going to limit myself to staying down at like 180 pounds. I'm going to allow my body weight to come up with time because I suspect my best lifting and my most competitive performances are going to come at a higher weight class once I've kind of filled out my leverages a little bit more. I'm not going to artificially restrict myself down. It's more of like a zoomed out thing to keep in the back of your head across your training career than it is like a speed run your way to this ASAP. And there's tons of athletes that are exceptions in either directions. There's guys who are unusually short for their class and successful. And sometimes there's guys who are unusually tall for their class and successful, though they might be the outlier. So it's a good thing to keep in mind, but it's not a hard and fast prescription.
Perfect. All right. What's a standard number of sets per main lift or muscle group you prescribe as a baseline? So this person's just looking for, if they're just getting into it, what?
Yeah, so he said like solid numbers would be good.
He wants a concrete
numbers would be good. And like I remember being super frustrated as a YouTube viewer, like when people would give me all of these cool like if-then statements and generalities, and it's like, if you adhere to these generalities, you're gonna do pretty good. And I'm like, you son of a bitch, give me a number. Just give me a fucking exercise. Like I understand all this principle-based stuff. Please give me something to do. Now I understand why people don't give them, right? Because like you said, it does vary from the athlete, and it can vary a lot, right? Some of my strongest athletes, we get to a period of their training where like for brief times, it's one working set per week. Or if I had like a really advanced lighter weight class female athlete with very technically efficient form, it's like, we're looking at like sometimes 20, 25 working sets of a movement pattern, right? If you want, like if I want to throw out numbers, again, it depends on how advanced you are, right? Because a lot of the people that watch YouTube, there's more beginners than there are intermediates, and there's more intermediates than there are advanced people. And I'm a little disconnected from that because almost all of my clients I would classify as advanced athletes. That being said, let's say squats, if we're squatting twice per week, like I think a lot of people would benefit from. Something like 4 to 5 sets of a regular squat on an A session, and then somewhere between 3 and 5 sets of like a pause squat on a B session is a very generic session that is a very generic breakdown of work that I would see work for a large number of athletes. Now, this is assuming you're also supplementing your volume with like a reasonable amount of bodybuilding work, right? Because all of my athletes, we're trying to put on lean tissue. It's very, very good for getting stronger to get bigger. So it's like, this isn't our only leg volume. We're doing like leg extensions. We're doing some split squats. We're doing some hack squats. So I think you need to bear that in mind. And some people would say, well, why don't you count the split squats and the hack squats towards the squat volume? You could. But I would say, yeah, anywhere from like, that would be 7 to 10 work sets of squat is like, I would say a pretty generic workload, assuming we're also supplementing with some assistance volume. For the bench press, we're bench pressing 2 to 3 sessions per week, kind of leverage dependent, how efficient the motor pattern is. Like guys will, when they're earlier on and they have less good control of their scaps, their shoulders will get banged up when they bench. So they can't bench 3 days a week. But as they get more efficient, even though the weight on the bar goes up, they might recover a little bit better. So then they might ease into 3 sessions, yada, yada, yada. So if we're benching like 2 days a week, you'd be looking at maybe 4 to 5 work sets per session, so 8 to 10. If we're benching 3 sessions per week, I could see anywhere from like 3 work sets to 6 work sets. Again, this gets muddy because there's also dumbbell benching in there. There might be a little bit of incline, a little bit of overhead, which might raise that tally of total pressing sets up to 20, right? But if we're talking sets of bench and its close variations, yeah, we're probably looking at somewhere between 8 to 15 working sets per week. And then deadlift is a little bit funky because it does really vary, right? If you've got an efficient sumo puller, the number of sets looks very different than like a round back, strong, conventional guy. But again, a generic prescription is maybe on our primary squat day, we might be hitting like 3 to 4 working sets of RDLs or stiff legs. So a variation that's going to work on our pure hip hinge pattern, but reduce our absolute load. And then on our primary deadlift day, we might be working 3 to 5 sets of pulls from the floor. Maybe some of those are with a pause, some without, maybe some from varied heights. But yeah, something like that where we're looking at like 6 to 8 for a conventional deadlifter, and that probably would bump up to like 8 to 12 for sumo potentially, just because the axial loading, like the axial fatigue there is a little bit less, torso is more upright, a little bit more dependent on the knee extensors, which tend to handle volume a little bit better than like a more kind of erector heavy pull.
All right.
Is that okay, you think?
Yeah, that's a good. You gave some good concrete numbers.
Okay.
And we're a little vague, but that's necessary.
Yeah, vague enough. Ranges is at least numbers.
Yes. How would you periodize training if you had concurrent, equally important goals of having as strong of a 12RM, 8RM, and 5RM as possible across various lifts? Would you slowly work your way down these different rep ranges and just skip the powerlifting training style peaking phase? And then how would that compare, in your opinion, to if you were to just train all 3 of them each week?
So this is how I do it. You could do either. There's people who take a more concurrent approach and get to a very high level of performance, and then there's people who take a more periodized approach and get to a very high level of performance. And it's important to note periodized training where, we're in a hypertrophy block. It's not like we aren't getting stronger during the hypertrophy block, and it's not like we aren't getting bigger during the strength block, right? So it's not like this is all block periodization is still somewhat concurrent, because in the strength block, I'm still doing leg extensions for leg hypertrophy. So it's not like we are training for like this like upper end strength, this more general strength, and these hypertrophy qualities and these work capacity qualities. We're training for all of these things at all times, but block periodization means we kind of shift our emphasis. So to answer your question, what I would probably do is earlier on when gains are really easy to come by, I would probably take more of like a daily undulating approach where I have a heavier day where I'm working on like more of that 5RM area, 5 to 8RM. And then I have a lighter day, more of that 8 to 12 RM territory, and just kind of see how much more like linear progress I can make on those. Once I outgrow linear progress, I would start periodizing in those ranges you find relevant. So 12s for a bit, 10s for a bit, 8s for a bit, 5s for a bit. Rinse and repeat, right? We can still periodize within that described range, kind of like you said, like a powerlifter might, but we're not taking it down to the 3 RMs and the 1 RMs. We're just rinse and repeating from 12 to 5. And that gives you kind of a novel stimulus while still getting to practice that main motion you want to get better at often. But things don't get stale because we're rotating between rep ranges. But like, it's like, okay, I've added weight to my 12s. I can't add any more weight to my 12s. Well, presumably after we do some 10s, some 8s, some 5s, by the time we get to the 12s again, we'll be able to we won't start at our all-time best on the 12s, but we'll be able to finish with a result better than the last time we were doing the 12s. That's all you can ask, right? Finish the 12s a little bit more than last time you did 12s, finish the 10s, finish the 8s, finish the 5s a little bit more than the last time, and then just rinse and repeat these training cycles once you can't just add weight every week like we all wish we could forever.
All right. Are unilateral exercises that important for minimizing potential overuse injuries or injuries connected to neglected muscles?
No, no. The only things that are like that important are preparing properly for your sessions, sleep, food, hydration, like the outside the gym variables, and then logical programming. The only thing that's like that important is sleeping and logical programming, right? You could do nothing but squat, and if your program is written reasonably, right? You organize your program to where each week logically leads to the next. We're working in with our recovery capabilities. Yeah, we should have a pretty minimal injury risk. Weight training is less injurious than other sports, according to that one study that everybody loves to cite. And a lot of that's predicated on the fact that we can be always really prepared for each week because we're picking what we do, right? You can't pick the positions you're in. You can't pick when someone runs into you on the football field. We can select our loads and auto-regulate those. So we can become really prepared. And that's the most important thing. Now, it sounds to me like you're trying to get out of doing unilateral leg exercises.
We all have.
Yeah, it's like, are they that important? No, the most important things is good load, like good programming and basic preparation for your sessions. Now, that being said, you're probably going to do some kind of leg volume after you squat. You finish up squatting, your hips or your low back couldn't handle much more work. Maybe you needed to spare your low back a little bit so you could do your RDLs afterward, and then your low back's fried. So it limits you. You can't do any more specific training. You probably are going to fill up a little bit more training volume for your legs because they could recover from a little bit more, right? You could leg press, you could leg extension. My point would be, hey, you're going to have to do this assistance work anyway. Why not select something that trains the quads and the glutes and the adductors quite well in that squat pattern that also helps us kind of reduce side-to-side asymmetry, kind of challenges the glute and the adductor in like a unique stabilizing fashion. It has these benefits that we speculate unilateral work has. Why not hit two birds with one stone other than the fact that it's hard? So no, the answer is they're not that important, but also the answer is why not? You're going to be doing some kind of leg assistance work anyway, presumably, and I would argue that doing something unilateral should probably make its way in there. Though I have plenty of athletes, if you magically got access to their spreadsheet, you're like, oh, he doesn't have unilateral exercise right now. Yep, I don't think he's going to die. We're going to rotate it back in at some point. We'll rotate it back out at some point. But there's not really a good concrete reason not to do them in my mind. So I guess that would be my answers. Don't just try to get out of doing it, but to answer your question, no.
All right. Do weighted dips have good carryover to exercises like overhead press or bench press?
So the more advanced you get, the less you'll expect carryover. Like you can't just be like, I am a very proficient bench presser or a very proficient overhead presser with a long training history. It's less and less likely. It can happen. It's happened to me. It's less and less likely that, I hit a 20-pound dip PR and my bench went up 10 or 20 pounds. When you're early on in your training, pressing carries over to pressing. Doesn't matter the plane. If you get your overhead press up, your bench goes up. If you get your dip up, your overhead press goes up. The more advanced you get, the less we can expect that. But that being said, that doesn't mean it's not super helpful. So this carryover thing early on, we get tons of carryover. The more advanced we get, the more we've kind of maximized how much we can bench, the less carryover we can expect, but it's still a great supplemental motion to keep your triceps strong for your bench presses or for your overhead presses. The nice thing about a dip is we can usually do more weight on downward presses than we can do on flat presses, which is more weight than we can do on incline presses, which is more weight than we can do on overhead presses. So basically we get this cool training effect of most people with equal training can do more total weight, body weight plus added load on a dip than they can bench press. So we get this training effect of locking the elbows with more than we can bench press for reps, which I find is very, very good for building up a surplus of tricep strength. I always like to have my athletes do a quick pause at the top of their dips. I think that's a valuable addition to the exercise for the training effect. For whatever reason, you'd think, your elbows are locked. That's not stimulative. It's stimulative. I don't know why, but yeah, it's a great background motion to have in. Early on, you can expect carryover. Later on, just having bigger triceps will potentiate your overhead press training and your bench training continuing to be effective. Big triceps tend to make things go smooth.
All right. Would you program the overhead press differently than the bench when it is the primary press?
I mean, yeah, eventually you're going to run into just like there's a lot of overlap there. So if you've observed some successful training strategies for your bench press, like, oh, I respond well to bench pressing 3 days a week, you're probably going to respond well to a little bit higher, like that higher frequency on the overhead press as well. So it leaves clues. It would be very, very surprising, given that they are just different lifts, if optimal programming for you was the exact same. But I would say that you can take a lot of those strategies that you observe to work for your bench press and use those as your initial guess to what's going to work for your overhead press, and then just make your adjustments from there. So, yes, there are differences, but things you've observed to work for your bench press is often a good jumping off point for learning how to really get your overhead press up and what works for you.
All right, we have two questions about mind muscle connection.
Okay.
One of them is asking how you would, as a coach, try to increase mind muscle connection for a client, like if they don't feel a muscle. And then also, how important do you think mind muscle connection is when strength is your end goal?
So I'll answer the second one. It's relatively important, right? We've got good evidence to suggest mind muscle connection is relatively important for getting the most out of our hypertrophy work. I'll beat this drum to death. Hypertrophy work matters for a strength athlete, especially for all of us who have not already filled out our weight class with muscle, right? We can look at guys like Andrei Milanichev who were deep into their training career and they were already carrying a ton of muscle. And basically their training was so taxing that they had to invest all of it into specific training. Everybody shy of that, everybody who's not topping out the 242 weight class shredded with muscle and having to weight cut to it, it's unbelievably important to just get the primary movers bigger. And part of effective bodybuilding training to get those primary movers bigger is having a mind muscle connection. I think there's some athletes that really hamper their long-term progression because they don't know how to connect with their muscles and they're not getting as much out of their hypertrophy work as they could. And also they make their hypertrophy work needlessly fatiguing because they're using as much weight as they can possibly shit row, when you could be getting better growth for your lats out of a good mind muscle connection row with less weight. So you spare more training economy to recover from your main stuff. So I would say, yeah, it matters. Does it matter on your squat, whether you're connecting with your quads? No. We're just trying to find a very efficient way to recruit as much muscle as possible to move as much weight as possible, right? So on the main lifts, am I too worried about mind muscle connection? Not necessarily. I do find that people can kind of know how to open up at their chest rather than kind of dump the weight into their shoulders. Do tend to succeed in the bench press a little bit more, but by and large, mind muscle connection, like, yeah, I like to feel my hamstrings in the start position, and that can be part of your cueing, but we're not necessarily looking for like great mind muscle connection on our exercises. We're trying to maximize our strength, but things that go after that are just trying to hypertrophy stuff, yeah, we probably do want to be feeling our primary movers working and never kind of losing that tension through the exercise. Now, in terms of teaching mind muscle connection, what do you think, oh bodybuilding master?
I This example Sam usually uses is when I started training, I did a lot of lat pull downs and never felt my lats for a long time. It took a long time of doing lat pull downs to finally have enough lat muscle. I feel like there's a point where you have enough muscle that you could finally start connecting with it. If you don't have any muscle, you're not going to be able to connect with it really well, probably. So doing a lot of something that you know is, biomechanically, you're going to be hitting that muscle, and doing a lot of reps with good form, you're going to be growing that muscle. And then eventually, if you're thinking about it, focusing on it, and trying to feel it, I feel like you'll eventually get there.
Yeah, well, like skill in bodybuilding training is connecting better and better with a muscle, and it's being able to tax a muscle more and more with the same weight. You don't just start out with a great mind muscle connection, just like how you don't start out with perfect technique for strength sports, right? So it's like Kirsten said, when she didn't know how to flex her lat. So it's like, yeah, if she doesn't know how to flex her lat just standing there, it's not likely she's going to have a great mind muscle connection and squeeze on it when she goes to row or pull down. But if we do pull downs in such a way that's like, this would be really, really tough to do without your lats doing a good bit of work with like this visually good form. We're trying to feel it. We're trying to find it. But even if we're failing, the lats are going to grow because we're doing the lift the way we're supposed to, right? And as that muscle grows, oh, I can kind of flex it now. Okay, I'm going to try to kind of flex it while I do the lift. And it's just something you build into with time, right? Some muscles are easier than others. Most people can kind of, okay, I feel my bicep burning. I can feel that little stretch. Pretty early on, people can find their biceps. Lats might take a little bit more time. Hamstrings and a hip hinge might take a little bit more time, but it's just practice. As the muscle gets bigger, it might be easier for you to connect with. So it's kind of a two-part system of always trying to keep your form visually good. So like exteroception, and then like trying to feel the right muscle like internally. So interoception, both of those are important for effective bodybuilding training, as I understand it. Yeah.
Sweet. Um, at what point is it?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go
I've got
ahead.
one more thing. And then some muscles are a little weird, right? Some exercises, there isn't really like a squeeze part of it. Because when people say feel the muscle, there's a couple things they mean, right? Some people say, okay, well, am I feeling like the buildup of like metabolites? Am I feeling the burn in the muscle? Good. You probably should be, right? If you're doing pull downs and you're just getting more and more burn in your biceps, that's not the end of the world, but it's maybe something to work on, right? And like change your cues, and maybe doing a thumbless grip, right? Helps me kind of get out of my biceps into my lats a little bit more, maybe changing my hand position. But some exercises don't really, so that you've got the metabolite buildup, that burn, you've got kind of a weighted stretch feeling, and you've got a squeeze feeling, right? The squeeze feeling is pretty easy to find. Dr. Mike would talk about how the squeeze is probably less important than the stretch sensation, but some exercises don't really have a squeeze per se. Like some chest press exercises, you're not really squeezing the chest at the top necessarily. We're just trying to feel a stretch in the pecs at the bottom, and that's what a good mind-muscle connection is. So what a good mind-muscle connection is going to feel very different from exercise to exercise. I don't really feel a squeeze in my hamstrings when I do an RDL. I'm just trying to control the weight, make sure my back angle stays relatively constant, go down, feel this big stretch in my hamstrings, come up. Feel this big stretch in my hamstrings, come up. Maybe I'll flex my glutes at the top, maybe I won't, right? Same thing with chest. It's more about finding that stretch, pressing out of it. Whereas some other exercises, that squeeze component is inherently a big part of mind-muscle connection, like a tricep press down. Should probably be squeezing.
All right. At what point is it better to do weak point training instead of just training the competition movement to get stronger? So I'm assuming he's asking about variations. Like when would you throw a variation in instead of
Yeah,
the comp
so
movement?
that's good old Rip. Mark Ripito would say, like a beginner, just practice the motion. You're just not very neurally efficient at it. You don't need, like, you're just weak overall. You don't need to do a variation of the squat. Just squat more often and get to the point where you're not a beginner anymore. Get to intermediate, and then we can start introducing some variation. And well, Rip says a lot of stuff that's wild and out of pocket and maybe not consensus among strength coaches. I don't think that's a bad take, right? I think early on, we don't need to have a tremendous amount of variation in our main lift. We just need to do that thing and get better at it. Now, once the athlete starts to get a little bit better and those strength gains are a little bit harder to come by, using variations that either highlight a weakness, that's kind of the old school talking point, is variation is attacking weaknesses. And maybe a little bit newer school talking point is using variations that highlight technical elements. These things aren't mutually exclusive, right? A squat with a pause at the lowest point emphasizes strength at the very bottom of a squat, but it also emphasizes keeping your core tight at the very bottom of the squat and not kind of relaxing as we hit the hole. It emphasizes kind of what are we doing with our knees? Are we driving out while we hold in the bottom of the squat? Are we remaining neutral? What are we doing, right? So most variations kind of attack your weaknesses, both from a skill and a strength perspective. And selecting those well is a great tool, not only to get stronger, which is how I always used to think about it, but if we're selecting them really well, they're also going to make us more skillful at the lift itself. And I don't think you have to be super advanced to start taking advantage of that, right? I'll be giving lifters pause squats pretty early in their training career just to highlight, like tempo squats, pause squats. Benches with a long pause, tempo benches, Larson presses, deadlifts with a pause, RDLs, right? These variations to highlight both strengths and technical elements, those are being introduced pretty early, right? So as long as they're well selected, I wouldn't worry too much. It's not the end of the world if you introduce those too early, right? It's like if you could be squatting twice a week and just adding weight, and you pull the trigger too early and you make one of those a pause squat. As long as you're adding weight each week, it's not the end of the world. It's not going to ruin your gains that you added in a variation before you needed to. That is fine. If you make one of your deadlift days an RDL, that is fine.
I think it's also helpful to note that, especially with motions that you're doing more than once a week, you can keep one day as a comp motion day and then just change the other day.
Yeah. And like some people would say, like, well, you could be adding weight twice a week, 5 pounds twice a week early on, so you may as well, right? It's like, that's fine. Or you could be doing one day main, one day variation. That's also fine. I do think, I don't see an epidemic of people consistently progressing close variations. I see an epidemic of people changing them way too often and never actually getting into the weeds. We get the novel adaptations of like, okay, well, I just started pause squatting. And I'm going to get really better I'm going to get better really fast for about 4 weeks because I'm just getting more skilled at it. It's neurological adaptation. We don't get into those kind of meat and potatoes, primarily like actual strength gains of putting on little bits of contractile tissue. We don't get into the weeds because we see another variation on the internet and we rotate it too quick. I do see an epidemic of that. So no problem with using variations even very early in your training career. Big issue with kind of that training ADHD, rotating what variation you use left and right all the time. That's probably, I see that being an issue a little bit more often. And also, I kind of on YouTube, because you hear a lot of advanced lifters talk about it. I think there's some guys that use self-limiting variations when they don't need to, right? Self-limiting variations, meaning variations that reduce the load on the bar while still doing a difficult set, like taking your belt off and pausing it. Trying to improve their stimulus to fatigue ratio. Stimulus to fatigue ratio is a ratio. So if the stimulus is relatively small in magnitude and the fatigue is small in magnitude, we don't necessarily need to be as cognizant of using these really good SFR exercises. We could probably just use the more taxing things more often because we're not so neurologically efficient. We're not moving such high absolute loads that we're even able to tax ourselves that bad. And that's something that kind of gets lost in communication. I know Paris has complained about that, like, oh, like you probably shouldn't be Larson pressing if you can't bench 2 plates. Like you don't need a self-limiting variation. Like I said, if you keep the Larson press in there on your secondary day consistently and just add weight with time, not the end of the world. But I do think people probably overvalue the utility of self-limiting variations early on, with the exception of RDLs, because even early in your training career, because newer athletes are relatively bad at bracing and relatively bad at deadlifting, even though they're not moving huge tonnages and they're not super neurally efficient, you can still beat yourself up pretty good with a couple sets of deadlifts. So something like an RDL is a self-limiting load. Okay, yeah, you got me. You don't have to be Hercules to really benefit from that. But I do think that's something that people maybe overthink a little bit. Not that there isn't value in it. But yeah.
All right, we're at the time limit I set, but there's 2 more good questions, so we're going to do 2 more.
Let's do it.
First is, when you look at building a base as a young strength athlete, is there a good argument for conjugate being the best approach, presuming strength is the goal, not powerlifting? So they're saying in a less specific scenario.
So they said conjugate?
Yes.
So conjugate, let's just say conjugate is like concurrent periodization. Like I said earlier, everything's going to be kind of concurrent. So a young strength athlete where it's like, yeah, we're working on our strength in these main motions, but we're also doing a lot of bodybuilding work. Just put simply, like maybe that bodybuilding work could be better selected. It's not just big quads. It's things that also help our squat, whatever. So there's going to be a concurrent element. I would contend, this is just how I think about it. I would contend, yes, it's going to be concurrent. Basically, there's going to be background hypertrophy work the vast majority of the year. So in that way, it's concurrent. I would still just kind of, as they get past the linear phase, I would look to rotate target rep ranges on the main motion with time rather than, because it's like you have to get your variety somewhere. You have to kind of get that novelty somewhere, right? So one guy might say, well, I'm going to keep my loading specific, which is kind of like the basis of more like West Side influenced conjugate, which is I'm doing max effort. That's the specificity, is doing something that's max effort. Because people say, oh, West Side doesn't care about specificity. No, they were just very concerned with the specificity of like doing a maximal effort and grinding a heavy weight for 1 rep. That's what they try to keep specific. And then they get their variety from changing the exercise. It's my personal preference to keep the exercise a constant and get our variety from altering the rep ranges, because in my mind, we can still do a hard rep at the end of our sets. So we can still tax that skill of doing difficult reps by taking our sets to a reasonable proximity of failure. So we're not completely neglecting that. That's just my preference, right? We have to get to that point where we have to get some novelty somewhere. I prefer getting my novelty from rotating target rep ranges rather than rotating exercises frequently.
Sweet.
Because I feel my athletes end up underskilled if we use really frequent exercise rotation on our main compounds. We can rotate our assistance work a little bit more frequently, but again, we're just kind of hanging out in those novelty gains before we get into the thick of like, okay, cool, we made some really rapid neural gains, but I would rather hang out on that exercise a little bit longer and stick with that curl variation to where we can't just add weight every week. We're just getting +1 rep. Let's get those +1s for a bunch of weeks in a row before the exercise gets really sticky, because those +1s are where we're actually focusing on making like those tiny little contractile gains, like contractile tissue gains, rather than just getting better at doing curls, right? So I think you can rotate those too often maybe, but it matters less. But main stuff, I like to keep it in there.
All right, you have to create a big 3 lifts for grappling martial artists to get strong at that will help their sport the most. What do you pick?
So this is a good one, right? I don't think you need to chase like your strength and conditioning, especially your strength side of your strength and conditioning, for combat sports in general. Doesn't need to be as precise and beautiful and like, oh, this is an athlete's training as you think, right? Gordon Ryan being like the quintessential example of I just do bodybuilding, bro. I do chest and back, and then I do fucking arms, right? And it's like it's worked fine. And this is something I noticed when I started weight training to supplement my sports is I was just doing generic bro training, and that's because I was also doing my specific training. Those general physical adaptations were translating to what they needed to be in the field. I didn't need to mirror my running in the gym. I didn't need to mirror my boxing in the gym. Just making these general adaptations and then doing my specific training kind of made that transition. So yeah, there's things that probably are better and worse uses of time, but don't worry too much. Really, just practicing your sport alongside your specific training, you're gonna derive a lot of those on field or in ring or in cage or on mat benefits of the weight training just from engaging in it. With time, we can learn more and more. Like, hey, when this lift is strong, I notice it when I'm rolling. And we can kind of establish core lifts for us, but we don't need it to be this really unique training routine right off the bat. We're going to get most of those benefits just from adding weight with time on a variety of movements. Now, that being said, I'll answer your question. I just like thinking like, yeah, I like just doing some bodybuilding work afterward, but we're going to think general movement patterns. We kind of got the 4 quartiles of the body. We got upper body pressing, we got upper body pulling, we've got hinging, we've got squatting, right? You'll hear this. Lots of strength and conditioning coaches like breaking it up into those things. For the pulling, the number one is every guy I've ever coached who does grappling is doing a bunch of pull-ups with hanging off a towel, hanging off a rope, hanging off a bar, different grips, different loading ranges. So sometimes with weight, sometimes with assistance, sometimes with body weight, sometimes max work in a time period, sometimes training for maximal strength. So we're training all kinds of different parameters, but holy shit, pull-ups are a really good idea for grapplers. Like if you want to use 1RM as your proxy for how good you are at them, we could probably do that. That's fine. Maybe you'd start to get beat up a little bit. Maybe use 5RM or 3RM instead because you just find that's a little bit less taxing. We go through hypertrophy phases of higher rep ranges. We're trying to get stronger anywhere from 1 to 20 reps on those. Just tons of work. Pull-ups in general, weighted pull-ups off a towel if we really want to tax our grip, especially if you train and compete in the gi. That's probably a decent idea to do those. Pull-ups for the upper body pull. I like doing like a zombie squat or a front squat for the squat pattern because it allows the most people to get into a really deep squat because we want to be strong through really lengthened ranges of motion to kind of create resilience through our lower body as well as mobility and strength in those mobile positions because mobility obviously matters quite a bit for a grappler. Lower body mobility when I was boxing didn't matter at all. A lot of the best boxers I've ever met couldn't touch their toes. They were very athletic, but they were not very flexible through the lower body. That does not scale to grappling, so I like selecting the squat that lets people go through a big range of motion, and it's not super neurally taxing because it's kind of self-limiting, right? I think there's a lot of value in that because you're not just going to be dead the next day when you roll. Your leg's going to be a little bit tired, but you're not going to be systemically thrashed like you would be if you did some heavy low bars and then we've got some pain in the arms. So I really like a zombie front squat, really deep. I like pull-ups. For the hinge, again, I like to promote using big ranges of motion. I know some people like trap bars, but that's like kind of a squat hinge hybrid, just like a deep stiff leg deadlift or a deep RDL. Again, we're just trying to get strong in really lengthened positions to promote both strength and mobility through the lower body. So I'd say like if I had a grappler and I said, here's your big 4, maybe I would probably give them something like pull-ups in all varieties, zombie front squats nice and deep, RDLs and progressing those to maybe off a deficit over time. And then just something like a dumbbell bench where we got that freedom of movement. We don't have to deal with our wrists getting quite as beat up, our elbows, our shoulders. We got that freedom of movement. We can take these really deep ranges of motion and train shoulders, chest, triceps kind of all together with like maybe a deep incline dumbbell press. Those would be 4 that come to mind. Now, if I thought about this a little bit more beforehand, maybe I would change those. But off the top of my head, those would be my 4 for you. Big 4.
The end.
The end.